Chris Mitchell stood in his office, overlooking the bustling lot of his dealership, Mitchell Motors. It was a sight he'd always taken pride in. Rows of gleaming trucks, their chrome shining in the sunlight. The dealership was one of the most successful in the state, with steady sales, loyal customers, and an ever-growing reputation for providing high-quality vehicles. But recently, something had begun to bother him. The reports, the ones he'd always eagerly awaited, had started to show a disturbing trend. Despite solid sales numbers, the customer feedback had begun to sour. More and more complaints were flooding in about hidden fees, unspoken charges, and aggressive sales tactics employed by his staff. It didn't make sense. How could everything look great on paper, yet the public's opinion seemed to be shifting in the opposite direction? Chris couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He had built this business from the ground up, dedicating countless hours, sleepless nights, and more sweat than he could count to ensure that Mitchell Motors stood for integrity and customer trust. This wasn't just about selling trucks. It was about providing an experience that made customers feel valued and respected. The thought that something might be rotting beneath the surface made his stomach churn. He'd always prided himself on building a business based on honesty. Yet, the recent reviews contradicted everything he stood for. Customers were complaining about things like unexplained fees added to their contracts, misleading information about vehicle prices, and high-pressure sales tactics that made them feel uncomfortable or, worse, taken advantage of. How had it gotten to this point? With these thoughts weighing heavily on his mind, Chris decided he needed to get to the bottom of things. The reports alone wouldn't give him the full picture. He had to experience it firsthand. He couldn't rely solely on second-hand information from staff or managers. He needed to see how the process unfolded from the customer's perspective. Chris had always believed that the best way to solve a problem was to understand it at the ground level, and so, after much deliberation, he made a decision that shocked even him. He would go undercover. Chris meticulously planned the entire operation. He couldn't just walk into his dealership as himself. That would defeat the purpose of the investigation. No one knew who he was in person anyway, given that he had been managing operations remotely for years. To do this right, he needed to become someone else entirely. So, he created an alter ego, Mike Thompson, a hard-working construction worker looking to purchase a reliable vehicle for his business. It wasn't the most glamorous backstory, but it would be perfect for what Chris needed. He carefully crafted every detail, from the clothes to the attitude. No one would suspect the wealthy, well-dressed owner of Mitchell Motors was standing right in front of them, in the form of an average Joe. The day of the operation arrived. Chris, now Mike Thompson, slipped into his old Toyota Corolla, an old, beat-up car that was a far cry from his usual luxury vehicle. He traded in his designer clothes for a simple flannel shirt, worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His watch, once an expensive timepiece, was replaced by a cheap, basic model from a drugstore. He looked nothing like the successful businessman he was. It was the perfect disguise, and Chris was determined to use it to uncover the truth. He drove to Mitchell Motors, parking in the same lot he'd owned for years. As he walked across the lot, he could already see the sales team buzzing around, engaging with customers. But his eyes were focused on something else. The employees in the showroom, particularly Dan Reynolds, the sales manager, who was eyeing the customers with a hawk-like gaze. Chris knew he needed to get inside and witness the sales process from start to finish, but the more he watched, the more he realized something felt off. The energy in the air felt forced, like something wasn't quite right. Despite the bustling activity around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his dealership, the one he had spent his entire career building, might be heading down a dangerous path. It was time to find out exactly what was happening, and Chris was prepared to do whatever it took to make things right. The morning sun streamed through the windshield of Chris Mitchell's old Toyota Corolla as he drove through the familiar streets toward his dealership, Mitchell Motors. The car was far from the sleek, black Mercedes he usually drove. It was worn down, the kind of vehicle a working man might drive. Humble, functional, and very much out of place in the parking lot of a high-end dealership. It was the perfect disguise. Chris had spent hours perfecting every detail of his alter ego, Mike Thompson. From the faded flannel shirt to the worn jeans and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, Mike Thompson was a construction worker, not someone who would attract any special attention. It was a character he had created meticulously for one purpose: to blend in. He knew that to uncover the truth, he had to experience everything firsthand, without anyone suspecting who he really was. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance. Chris had worked hard to adopt Mike's persona. Someone who had been in the construction business for years, someone who knew what he wanted but was always looking for a reliable, affordable option. He couldn't just show up as Chris Mitchell, the owner of Mitchell Motors. That would ruin the entire investigation. He needed to see how the sales process worked from the perspective of an ordinary customer, to understand what was really going on behind the scenes. As he drove, Chris felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. What would he find? Was the dealership really as bad as the complaints suggested? He was about to find out. Arriving at Mitchell Motors, Chris parked the Toyota far from the showroom, making sure to walk as casually as possible. The lot was busy, with trucks parked neatly in rows, gleaming in the sunlight. It was the same dealership he had built and nurtured for years, but today it felt different. It felt distant, almost foreign. He could feel the tension in the air, like a heaviness that had settled in his business, one that he had failed to notice until now. He adjusted his baseball cap and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. As he approached the showroom, he couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast between the well-dressed salespeople and his own modest attire. He was a stranger here now, and that was exactly how it needed to be. As Chris entered the showroom, the familiar smell of fresh leather and polished metal filled the air. He took a moment to look around, observing the scene as though he was a first-time customer. Salespeople were busy engaging with customers, offering them test drives and walking them through the features of various models, but his eyes were drawn to one particular salesman: Ryan. Ryan had only recently joined the team, and Chris had never met him in person. The young man was standing by the door, scanning the lot, and when his eyes landed on Chris, he broke into a wide, practiced grin. It was the kind of smile Chris had seen hundreds of times from his sales staff, one that was part charm and part strategy. Ryan's approach was quick, confident, and without hesitation. "Hey there, welcome to Mitchell Motors. My name's Ryan. What brings you in today?" Ryan asked, his voice bright with enthusiasm as he stepped forward, offering a handshake. Chris, keeping up the persona of Mike Thompson, extended his hand and gave a friendly but slightly unsure smile. "Hi, Mike Thompson. Been saving up for a while, looking for a reliable truck for work, something that can handle the tough stuff." He deliberately kept his voice a little higher than usual, playing the role of a blue-collar worker who knew what he was talking about, but wasn't looking to get too flashy. Ryan's eyes lit up at the mention of a potential sale. "Well, Mike, you've come to the right place. We've got just what you need: heavy-duty trucks, built to last. Let me show you our best models." With that, Ryan gestured toward a row of trucks, his smile never wavering. Chris followed him, taking in every word, every movement. He noticed how Ryan was careful to highlight the truck's power, towing capacity, and the exclusive protection package they offered. Everything was geared toward making the sale as smooth and easy as possible, but also, it seemed, as aggressive as possible. Chris kept his expression neutral, occasionally nodding as Ryan went on, playing the part of the interested customer. He was here to observe, to gather information, and to understand how deeply the dealership's problems ran. Was it just one salesperson, or was this part of a larger issue that had infected the entire operation? Chris had to find out. As they walked along the row of trucks, Chris couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. These were his trucks, his business, but today he was just another man trying to buy a vehicle and getting caught in a web of sales tactics designed to push customers beyond their comfort zones. He had to see it through. As they arrived at a silver Ford F-150, one of the dealership's most popular models, Chris could feel his heart rate pick up slightly. This was the moment. Ryan was about to make his pitch. The truck was priced just slightly above Chris's budget, which was exactly what he had expected. He was going to see how the team handled this situation, how they would present the fees, and what tactics they would use to close the deal. Ryan started talking about the truck's capabilities, focusing on features Chris already knew well, but the next part of the pitch, the one about the protection package, was where things would get interesting. Would Ryan try to upsell him with something that wasn't necessary? Would he hide any costs until the paperwork stage? Chris was about to find out. Chris stood quietly as Ryan enthusiastically began his pitch, leading him toward the silver Ford F-150 that was displayed at the front of the showroom. The truck gleamed under the bright showroom lights, its clean lines and shiny chrome inviting admiration. Chris had to admit it was a beautiful vehicle. It was exactly the type of truck he would have chosen for his construction business. Reliable, tough, and able to handle the wear and tear of a demanding work environment, but he wasn't here to buy a truck for himself. He was here to gather evidence, to see firsthand how the sales tactics at Mitchell Motors had evolved. And so far, the signs weren't promising. Ryan, full of energy, launched into his pitch with practiced ease. This is one of our most popular models, Mike. The Ford F-150, built to last. You can haul anything, tow anything, and with the powerful engine, it's perfect for construction work. You'll never have to worry about reliability again. And this beauty just came in last week, so you're getting the newest model. Ryan's words came fast, his tone smooth, almost too smooth. Chris nodded along, pretending to be impressed, while his mind focused on something more important. Ryan's next words. And the best part, Mike, Ryan continued, is that this truck comes with our exclusive Carter's protection package. It's all inclusive. You don't have to worry about a thing. This package covers everything from the engine to the tires, and it's a great value. Chris's ears perked up at that. He knew that the protection package wasn't something that came with every vehicle by default. It was an optional add-on. It was never supposed to be automatically included in the price of a truck, at least not without prior discussion. This wasn't the first time he had heard of this tactic, but hearing it again from a salesman at his own dealership made his stomach twist. The package was being pushed hard, without a single mention of the fact that it was an extra cost. Ryan was clearly trying to sell Chris something he didn't need. The F-150 was already an expensive truck at its base price of $37.00. But Chris knew that Ryan wasn't going to stop there. He had seen this happen before, back when he was just starting the dealership. Salespeople adding unnecessary fees and packages to drive up the price without ever explaining the true costs. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a systematic approach to inflate the price and maximize profit, and it was happening right under his nose. Chris followed Ryan's lead as they walked around the truck, trying his best to play the role of an interested customer while his mind raced. He noticed Ryan's quick glances toward the showroom and, most notably, toward the office where Dan, the sales manager, was standing, watching them closely. The entire interaction felt rehearsed, like a well-practiced routine. Ryan wasn't just trying to sell a truck, he was trying to sell an idea. A narrative that this truck, combined with the protection package, would make Chris' life easier, safer, and more secure. But in reality, it was just a sales tactic designed to manipulate emotions and drive up the price. As Ryan led Chris through the final steps of the pitch, Chris realized that the base price of the truck was just the beginning. The true cost was hidden in the additional fees that Ryan was glossing over: processing fees, market adjustment fees, the mandatory extended warranty. Each of these fees was being introduced as if they were just part of the deal. But Chris knew better. These weren't standard fees. They were optional extras, added at the last minute to increase the price and make the sale more lucrative for the dealership. Ryan's voice had become more confident as he moved through the paperwork, but Chris could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a sales pitch anymore. This was a game of manipulation, and Chris was playing along to expose it. Chris's suspicions grew as the numbers on the form began to climb. What had started as a $37,000 truck quickly turned into something far more expensive. Between the protection package, the processing fees, and the extra services that were now mandatory, the total was pushing $45.00, well beyond what Chris had initially expected. The whole process felt rushed, like Ryan was trying to get him to sign the paperwork before he had a chance to fully understand the cost breakdown. The urgency in Ryan's tone, the way he constantly circled back to the benefits of the package, all of it made Chris uncomfortable. He had to admit, the thought of exposing this kind of behavior made him feel nauseous. As Ryan finished explaining the details, Chris knew he had to keep going. He couldn't let this go unnoticed. There was something deeply wrong with what was happening here. Ryan's tactics, the pressure, the hidden fees, it was all part of a much larger scheme to take advantage of customers. But Chris needed more than just his gut feeling. He needed hard evidence. So, he decided to continue with the process, at least for a while longer. He would gather the information he needed to take action. He wouldn't let this slide, not when his business, his reputation, was at stake. "Actually, Ryan," Chris said, maintaining his role as Mike Thompson, "I'd like to take a closer look at all these fees. Can you give me a breakdown of everything before we move forward?" His voice was casual, but inside his pulse quickened. He was about to gather the evidence he needed to bring everything to light, and nothing was going to stop him from uncovering the truth about what was really going on at Mitchell Motors. As Chris sat at the desk, pretending to scrutinize the paperwork Ryan had handed him, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The numbers on the contract seemed to multiply with each line he read, and the hidden fees were adding up in ways he hadn't expected. But it wasn't the details of the deal that caught his attention next. It was the voices. From across the room, the raised tones of a heated argument drifted over to him, cutting through the otherwise calm atmosphere of the showroom. Chris didn't need to look up to know that something wasn't right. He had heard that tone of frustration before, the voice of a customer being pushed to their breaking point. The voices became louder, and the tension in the air thickened. Chris glanced up, his eyes instinctively drawn toward the commotion. Across the showroom, a middle-aged man, clearly distressed, was standing at one of the sales desks. His name tag read Mark Thompson. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists as he argued with Brad Stevens, the sales manager. Brad stood behind the desk, his posture stiff and his expression cold, almost disinterested, as Mark's words seemed to bounce off him like raindrops on a windshield. It was clear that Mark was trying to make a point, but his voice, filled with frustration, was barely able to break through Brad's calm, almost dismissive demeanor. Chris shifted slightly in his seat, trying to stay under the radar as the exchange grew more intense. Mark's voice, trembling with anger and desperation, cut through the air. "I don't understand. You told me the price would be $32,000, not $35,000. Where did all these extra fees come from? This isn't what we agreed on. My family has saved every penny for this, and now you're telling me I can't afford it." The words were heavy with the weight of a broken promise. Chris could see it in Mark's eyes, the fear of losing something his family had worked so hard for. And the worst part was, it wasn't just the truck at stake. It was the deposit, the one thing that stood between Mark's family and financial ruin. Brad's response was a textbook example of indifference. With a slight, almost mechanical smile, he leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the desk, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, I really do. But all of these fees are clearly outlined in the agreement you signed. If you had taken the time to read the fine print, you would have seen that." He paused for a moment, his gaze flicking to the contract that Mark had placed in front of him, as if trying to dismiss the situation with a single, cold remark. "These are standard components of our financing structure, Mr. Thompson. The market adjustment fee, the mandatory extended warranty, and our premium service package. These are all included. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." Chris's blood began to boil as he listened. Brad wasn't offering a solution. He was simply shifting the blame onto Mark, as though the man had somehow been at fault for not understanding the fine print. Chris knew exactly what Brad was doing. It wasn't about the fine print. It wasn't about fairness. It was about making the sale, no matter the cost to the customer. And here, once again, the customer was the one being forced to carry the weight of the dealership's greed. Mark's confusion was palpable, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "You don't get it, do you?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke, his grip tightening around the contract. "I've been saving for 2 years to make this purchase. I can't afford these extra charges. I can't even afford to lose the deposit. I've already put down $5,000. Chris's heart sank as he saw the look of defeat spreading across Mark's face. It was a look he knew too well, a look he had seen in his own father's eyes years ago when he was cheated out of his own hard-earned money by a similar tactic at another dealership. Mark wasn't just losing money, he was losing hope. Chris could see it in his eyes. The man was trapped. His family's financial future was tied to this truck, to the deposit he had placed down, and now Brad was threatening to take that away. This wasn't just a sales issue, it was a matter of trust, and it was being shattered in front of Chris's eyes. Mark's desperation was turning to panic, and his voice trembled as he pleaded, "Please, Brad, I can't lose this deposit. I've been telling my wife this is it. This is the truck we need for our business. I promised her we'd be okay. I can't tell her we lost everything." His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken promises and the pressure of responsibility. Chris watched as Brad, utterly unmoved, simply tapped the contract with a cold smile. "Like I said, Mr. Thompson, you should have read the fine print. There's nothing I can do. If you can't pay the difference, we'll have to cancel the deal and you'll forfeit your deposit. You knew the terms when you signed." Chris felt a deep, gnawing anger rise within him. Brad's lack of empathy was appalling. He wasn't offering a solution, not even an ounce of compassion. Mark was at his breaking point, and Brad's words were like salt in an open wound. There was no negotiation, no understanding, just a cold, calculated demand for more money, with the threat of taking everything Mark had worked for. Chris clenched his jaw and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't sit by any longer. He had to act. This was exactly what he had feared, a system that exploited customers, that trapped them in financial distress just to line the pockets of the dealership. And now it was time to make it right. With a final glance at the devastated Mark, Chris made up his mind. He would confront this corruption head-on. He would no longer let his dealership be a place where customers were treated with such indifference and cruelty. As Mark stood there, defeated, Chris stood up from his seat. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't allow this to continue. For the sake of his business, for the sake of every customer who had been wronged, he had to uncover the truth and put an end to the manipulative tactics that had taken root in his dealership. The time for silence was over. It was time for action. Chris sat at the desk, his mind racing as he absorbed the scene unfolding before him. Mark's desperation hung thick in the air, and Brad's cold indifference to the man's plight made Chris's blood boil. It wasn't just about a single transaction gone wrong. It was the entire system that was broken. Everything he had built over the years, everything he had strived for, was now being tainted by the very people he had trusted to carry on his vision. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Brad wasn't just one rogue salesman. This was a systemic issue, woven into the fabric of his dealership's sales tactics. The hidden fees, the unnecessary add-ons, the emotional manipulation. It was all part of a well-oiled machine designed to squeeze every last penny out of unsuspecting customers. Chris had known something wasn't right, but now, watching Mark's interaction with Brad, the full extent of the scam became clear. Brad wasn't merely pushing the protection package. It was part of a much larger strategy. Chris had always been a firm believer in transparency and honesty, in treating every customer with the respect they deserved. But now, as he watched Brad's every move, he realized just how deep the deception ran. The F-150 that Mark was trying to purchase wasn't just overpriced. It was being inflated, with charges that were never disclosed up front. Ryan's mention of the Carter's protection package had been just the tip of the iceberg. As the paperwork continued, Chris noticed how the numbers seemed to magically climb with each new line. Processing fees, market adjustment charges, and a long list of mandatory extras that were suddenly added to the deal, and each time Brad was there, smoothly assuring Mark that these were standard charges, that this was the price of doing business with a high-end dealership. Chris's heart sank as he realized the full scope of the scam. It wasn't just the protection package. It was a deliberate strategy designed to manipulate customers into paying more for vehicles that should have been priced much more reasonably. Salespeople like Ryan weren't simply instructed to make the sale, they were being trained to emotionally manipulate customers, to get them invested in the idea of owning a truck before they ever saw the final price. This was the first part of the scam. Get the customer emotionally hooked on the vehicle, make them feel like they needed it, and then, once their guard was down, hit them with the hidden fees. Brad's tactics were working flawlessly. Mark was already so invested in the truck that he was willing to stretch his budget just to make sure he didn't lose out. But that was exactly what Brad wanted. Customers who were so emotionally attached to a deal that they would accept any price, no matter how inflated. The second part of the scam was even more insidious. Chris could see it in Brad's behavior as he dealt with Mark's complaints. Every word was calculated to deflect blame and manipulate the situation in the dealership's favor. Brad didn't care about Mark's financial struggles, his family's dreams, or the deposit that had taken years to save. What mattered to Brad was the sale, and if Mark had to pay an extra $3,000 just to keep his deposit and get the truck, so be it. Brad was masterfully directing the conversation to make Mark feel like the problem was his own fault, not the dealership's. "If you had just read the fine print, Mr. Thompson, you wouldn't be in this situation," Brad had said, as though that somehow justified the additional charges. The entire interaction felt rehearsed, like Brad had done this countless times before, and his ability to twist the truth, to turn the tables on Mark, was part of his training. Chris could feel the weight of the manipulation hanging in the air, and it made him sick to his stomach. As Chris continued to observe, his suspicions were confirmed. Mark, already in a vulnerable position, was being pushed even further into a corner. He was now faced with a choice that no one should ever have to make. Either pay the extra $3,000, 0 cents, or lose his deposit, money he couldn't afford to lose, especially with a family depending on him. Brad's cold response to Mark's plea for help made it clear that this wasn't just a bad apple. This was the way the dealership was operating. This was how they made their money. By preying on customers who didn't fully understand the terms, by adding hidden charges to the final price, and by using emotional tactics to manipulate people into paying more than they could afford. Chris had seen enough. His worst fears had been realized. This wasn't a one-off incident. It was a pattern, a well-established method for squeezing as much money as possible from every customer who walked through the door. Chris's mind raced as he watched Mark's face fall, his shoulders slump in defeat. The scam wasn't just about the money. It was about destroying the trust customers had in the dealership. Chris had built this business on the foundation of honesty and integrity, but now that foundation was crumbling before his eyes. He had worked so hard to create a place where people could buy trucks without feeling taken advantage of, where they could trust the salespeople in the process. But now that trust had been shattered. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't allow his name, his reputation, to be tied to this kind of behavior. Chris stood up, his decision made. He would confront Brad, and he would confront the entire system that had allowed this scam to take root. He couldn't keep watching from the sidelines. As much as it hurt, as much as it felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for, Chris knew that the only way to fix this was to expose the truth. He would stop this scam, not just for Mark, but for every customer who had been affected and for the future of his dealership. The time for action had come. He couldn't let this slide any longer. It was time to take control and restore the integrity of Mitchell Motors, no matter the cost. Chris took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. He had already seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong at Mitchell Motors, but he needed more. A fleeting moment of anger surged through him, but he quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the time for rage. It was the time for careful observation and documentation. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As he sat at the desk, pretending to focus on the paperwork in front of him, his ears remained sharp, listening to the interactions around him. Every word, every gesture was important. He needed solid evidence, something concrete that he could use to confront Brad and expose the systematic corruption that had taken root in his dealership. Over the next few hours, Chris continued to watch, keeping a careful eye on the sales floor. He saw how the salespeople interacted with customers, how they pitched the vehicles, and how they used every trick in the book to manipulate the situation in their favor. It wasn't just about getting a sale. It was about making sure the customer paid more than they had ever intended to. Each time a potential buyer showed interest, the sales team would pounce, using emotionally charged language to create a sense of urgency. The customers, unsuspecting and eager, were then pushed to accept higher prices and additional charges that were never clearly explained. Chris documented every instance of this manipulation. He noted the fees that were added at the last minute, fees that had no place in the original agreement. He wrote down the names of the salespeople, the cars, and the hidden costs. He needed to build a solid case, one that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. As the day wore on, Chris overheard a conversation between two salespeople near the break room. They were talking in hushed tones, but Chris's sharp ears picked up every word. "Did you hear about that guy who just bought the F-150? One of the salespeople laughed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, that guy had no idea what hit him. We hit him with that protection package and the processing fee. He barely noticed, just signed on the dotted line." The other salesperson chuckled in response. "I swear, these people are so easy. Just get them invested in the truck, make them fall in love with it, and the rest is easy. They'll pay whatever we ask. They never even question it. We just added another $3,000 0 cents to the sale, and they didn't bat an eye." Chris's stomach churned as he listened to their conversation. It was as if they were discussing their latest conquest, boasting about how easily they had manipulated a customer into paying more than they had intended. The laughter was casual, almost celebratory, as if tricking people into paying inflated prices was a game to them. Chris felt a surge of disgust rise in him. This wasn't just a bad business practice, it was exploitation, and it was happening under his watch. He couldn't let it continue. He took a mental note of the salespeople involved in the conversation and the specific tricks they were using. He knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. He couldn't trust these people to change on their own. He needed more. He needed a way to confront Brad, to bring everything into the open, and to stop this once and for all. But he also knew that confronting Brad without enough evidence would be risky. It wouldn't be enough to simply tell him what he had overheard. Chris needed hard proof. Proof that Brad was aware of the manipulation and actively encouraging it. If he wanted to expose the truth, he needed to gather everything he could, leaving no room for denial. As Chris continued to observe the dealership, he grew more methodical in his approach. He began to take notes on every sale, every interaction. He even started recording conversations when he could, keeping his phone discreetly in his pocket. He had already seen enough to know that this was more than just a few rogue employees. Brad was at the center of it all, pulling the strings, encouraging his team to inflate prices, hide fees, and manipulate customers into agreeing to deals they didn't fully understand. Chris had to admit to himself that the task ahead was daunting. He wasn't just fighting to fix a few bad sales. He was trying to root out a culture of deceit that had permeated the dealership. It would take time, but he was willing to put in the effort. This wasn't just about the customers. It was about the integrity of his business. He couldn't let Mitchell Motors become a symbol of corruption and greed. It was at that moment, as Chris watched another transaction unfold, that he realized he had enough evidence to confront Brad. He had heard the conversations, seen the tactics, and recorded the proof, but something in him hesitated. He had been running this business for years, and the thought of exposing Brad, someone he had trusted, felt like a betrayal. But it wasn't a betrayal, it was justice. The customers deserved better, and he couldn't keep looking the other way. Chris made a decision. He would confront Brad, but he would do it carefully. He had to make sure that everything was in order, that every piece of evidence was in place. The confrontation had to be decisive and impactful, one that would leave no room for escape or denial. Chris knew that the time for action was fast approaching. But before he could do anything, he needed to gather one final piece of evidence. Something that would tie Brad directly to the scam. Something that could not be denied. The clock was ticking, and Chris was running out of time. The day had come. Chris had gathered all the evidence he needed, every piece falling into place like a puzzle that had been carefully assembled over the course of several days. He had observed, documented, and listened, all while playing the part of a quiet observer. But now, it was time for action. His mind was set. He couldn't let the scam continue, not when it was clear that Brad Stevens, the sales manager, was at the heart of it. Chris had watched Brad manipulate customers, inflate prices, and pressure his staff into using deceptive tactics. It was time to confront him, to make him face the consequences of his actions. Chris walked through the dealership, his footsteps echoing through the quiet showroom. His heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. He had been planning this moment for days, and now that it was here, he couldn't afford to show any hesitation. As he reached Brad's office, he took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. Brad's voice called from inside, smooth and confident. "Come in." Chris opened the door, stepping inside with a calm, deliberate motion. Brad was sitting at his desk, reviewing some papers, but he looked up immediately, his face breaking into a practiced smile. "Well, well, Mr. Thompson, what can I do for you?" he asked, his tone oozing with false friendliness. Chris didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He had come here for one reason, to expose the truth. "Brad, I've been watching how things are being handled here," Chris began, his voice steady but firm. "I've seen the hidden fees, the protection packages, the market adjustment charges. I know what's going on. This dealership is scamming customers, and you're at the center of it." Brad's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and let out a small chuckle. "Scamming customers? Now that's a strong word, Mike. I think you're overreacting." His tone was dismissive, almost amused. "These are just standard business practices, things that customers agree to when they sign the paperwork. It's all laid out in the fine print." Chris felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. He knew that this confrontation needed to be more than just words. He had to get Brad to admit to what he was doing, to make him say it out loud, so there could be no doubt about his involvement in the scam. "No, Brad," Chris said calmly. "It's not fine print. It's hidden fees. It's manipulation. You're pressuring customers to sign contracts they don't fully understand. You're adding extra charges after the deal is made, and you're pretending it's all part of the process. That's not standard. It's fraud." Brad's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Chris saw a flicker of something real. Fear. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by an arrogant, almost mocking smile. "Fraud, huh? That's rich coming from the owner of the dealership. You've been making millions off of these tactics, Mike. Don't act like you're suddenly a saint." Chris's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. He had expected Brad to deny everything, to deflect blame, but this response was different. Brad wasn't just trying to justify his actions, he was boasting. Boasting about his success in manipulating customers, about the profits he had made by exploiting them. "Look, Mike," Brad continued, his tone now more casual. "This business isn't about being nice. It's about making money. You're too busy focusing on your shiny new locations and expansion plans to see what's happening on the ground. But I've been making this dealership work, keeping the numbers up. The customers don't know what's good for them. We show them what they want, we make them feel like they need it, and then they sign. Simple as that." His voice had a confident edge, as if he believed he was untouchable. "And honestly, if you've got a problem with it, we can work something out," he added, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm sure we could come to an agreement, Mike. Maybe you wouldn't have to expose everything. Maybe we can keep this between us, make a little deal." Chris's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. Brad had just crossed a line. He was offering a bribe. Not only had he admitted to the scam, but he was now attempting to buy Chris's silence. It was more than Chris had anticipated, but it was exactly the kind of admission he needed. Chris felt his phone vibrating in his pocket, and he knew it was time. He had been recording everything from the moment he walked into the room, capturing every word, every confession, every arrogant boast. He needed this, the irrefutable evidence, to ensure that Brad could not escape the truth of his actions. "Brad," Chris said, his voice low and steady, "you've just sealed your fate. I've been recording everything you've said. Every word. Every confession. Brad's face drained of color as he realized what Chris meant. His smile faltered, and the arrogance that had been so prominent only moments before disappeared, replaced by fear. "What?" Brad stammered, leaning forward, panic creeping into his voice. "You can't do that. You can't—" But Chris didn't let him finish. "I already have, Brad, and when this gets out, everyone will know exactly who you are and what you've been doing." The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Brad sat frozen, his eyes darting around the room, searching for some way to turn the situation in his favor. But Chris was done listening. He had the evidence he needed. The conversation had been recorded, and now there was no going back. Chris stood up, his decision final. "You're finished here, Brad. You've been caught, and now it's time to face the consequences. You'll be exposed for everything you've done, and I'll make sure that the truth comes to light. You may have thought you were untouchable, but you were wrong." Chris turned to walk out of the office, his heart pounding, but he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The truth was out, and now Brad would have to answer for his actions. The hard work was over. The fight for justice had just begun. Chris stood at the front of the dealership showroom, his mind racing, but his resolve steady. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment he had prepared for. He could feel the weight of what was about to unfold, but he couldn't back down. The truth had to come out. Brad Stevens, the sales manager, had spent months, if not longer, manipulating customers, inflating prices, and hiding fees in a bid to increase his own profits. The time for secrets was over. Chris took a deep breath, and in that moment, everything seemed to fall silent, as though the whole dealership was holding its breath. It was late afternoon, and most of the sales team had gathered in the showroom to finalize their deals. There was a buzz of conversation, the usual light chatter of employees wrapping up for the day. But when Chris stepped onto the small raised platform in front of the desks, everything stopped. Salespeople looked up from their work, some of them startled by his sudden appearance. Others watched with curiosity. Chris didn't give them time to react. He stood tall, his presence commanding attention, and in a calm, authoritative voice, he spoke. "I'm sure you've all been wondering why I've been so quiet, why I've been out of sight for the past few days. The truth is, I've been here, observing, listening to everything happening at Mitchell Motors. And what I've seen and heard has been shocking." A few whispers rippled through the room, but Chris didn't pause. He knew the moment for explanation had passed. He wasn't here to ease anyone into the truth. He was here to expose it. "My name is Chris Mitchell," he said, his voice firm, ensuring that every employee in the room understood the significance of what he was about to say. "And I am the owner of this dealership." The room fell completely silent. Some faces registered surprise, others confusion. They didn't know it was him. Chris had been operating under the alias of Mike Thompson, his undercover identity, for days. But now, there was no hiding. The truth was out in the open, and there was no going back. Chris's gaze locked onto Brad, who had been standing near the back of the room, watching with a mix of disbelief and growing panic. "Brad Stevens," Chris continued, his voice colder now. "I've been watching everything you've been doing here. All the manipulation, the hidden fees, the deceit you've been peddling to every customer who walks through this door. And I have the evidence to prove it." As Chris spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He hit play, and the showroom was filled with the unmistakable sound of Brad's own voice. The conversation Chris had recorded earlier, the one where Brad arrogantly boasted about his success in deceiving customers and even offering a bribe, played out for everyone to hear. Brad's face turned ashen as his own words filled the air. "We hit him with that protection package and the processing fee. He barely noticed, just signed on the dotted line." The laughter that followed from the recording sent a chill through the room. Chris could see Brad's fingers twitching nervously, but he didn't give him a chance to speak. He let the full weight of Brad's words sink in, letting everyone hear the truth that had been hidden for so long. The room was dead quiet, the salespeople frozen in place, each one processing the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Chris watched as Brad's expression shifted from disbelief to anger, but Chris was resolute. "Brad Stevens," Chris said, his tone now hard and final, "you're fired, effective immediately. Your actions have not only destroyed the trust of our customers, but also compromised the integrity of this business. You have no place here." Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room remained still, and Chris could feel the eyes of every employee on him. This was a pivotal moment, one that would set the tone for everything that would follow. He wasn't just removing Brad. He was taking a stand for the kind of business he wanted to run. A business built on trust, transparency, and integrity. The kind of business Mitchell Motors had always been meant to be. Chris then turned his attention to the rest of the staff, who were still reeling from the revelation. "But this is just the beginning," he said, his voice resolute, cutting through the shock in the room. "I'm not just firing Brad. I'm going to make sure that what's been happening here stops today. I'm announcing a full review of all sales and contracts over the past 6 months. Every deal, every fee, every contract will be examined to ensure that no customer has been deceived or manipulated. If any of you were complicit in these actions, I expect you to come forward now. If you choose to stay silent, you will face the consequences." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was tense, the silence thick with anticipation. Chris knew this wasn't going to be easy. There would be some who would try to cover their tracks, but he was ready for that. The truth was too important to ignore. Chris continued, "We are going to rebuild this dealership. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But we are going to restore the trust that has been lost. We are going to operate with integrity, and we are going to make sure that every customer who walks through those doors knows they are being treated fairly." His voice softened slightly as he addressed the employees, some of whom were looking down, guilt written across their faces. "I know many of you are new here, and you may not have known what was happening behind the scenes. But from now on, things are going to be different. No more hidden fees, no more pressure tactics, just honesty. That's what Mitchell Motors stands for, and that's what we will stand for from now on." With those final words, Chris turned away from the group, but not before making one last point. "I will be overseeing the changes myself. I'll be here in the showroom, working with each of you, ensuring that we're doing the right thing by our customers. If you're committed to that vision, I welcome you to stay. If not, I suggest you leave now, because this is a new beginning for Mitchell Motors, and there's no place for corruption in it." Chris stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The employees stood frozen, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in silent agreement. The air in the room had changed, the tension replaced with something new. Hope. Hope that things could be fixed, that integrity could be restored. Chris knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he was prepared to walk down, no matter the obstacles. And with that, the first step toward redemption had been taken. The weeks following Brad Stevens' departure were some of the most challenging and rewarding Chris had ever experienced in his career. Mitchell Motors, once a dealership built on the illusion of success, was now in the process of being rebuilt from the ground up. Chris knew that regaining the trust of his customers wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. The first step was clear: transparency. Everything had to be laid out in the open, from the pricing of the vehicles to the fees attached to each sale. The days of hidden charges and last-minute add-ons were over. Chris spent long hours revising the dealership's pricing structures, ensuring that every customer who walked in the door would know exactly what they were paying for and why. The transformation didn't stop at pricing. Chris knew that the entire culture of the dealership needed to shift. The sales team had to understand that their job wasn't just about selling vehicles, it was about building relationships, creating long-term trust with their customers. He implemented new policies that required every sales associate to go over the full cost breakdown with every customer, including taxes, fees, and optional add-ons, before any paperwork was signed. No longer would customers be hit with unexpected charges when they arrived at the final step of the purchase. Chris also introduced a new training program for all sales staff, focused on ethical sales practices, customer care, and the importance of honesty in every interaction. The goal wasn't just to sell cars. It was to provide a positive, transparent experience that made customers feel respected and valued. In addition to these internal changes, Chris also focused on addressing the mistakes of the past. He knew that rebuilding the dealership's reputation wasn't just about changing the way things were done. It was about taking responsibility for the harm that had already been caused. One of the most immediate actions he took was to refund any customers who had been overcharged due to the hidden fees and deceptive practices. Chris personally called each of them, offering a full refund and an apology for the way they had been treated. Some were surprised, others grateful, but every single one of them appreciated the honesty. For many of them, the refunds weren't just about the money. They were a sign that Chris was genuinely committed to making things right. The goodwill generated by these actions quickly spread through the community, and Chris could feel the momentum building. Mitchell Motors was no longer a place where people felt cheated. It was becoming a place where they felt heard, respected, and valued. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of these changes began to show. The dealership's atmosphere was markedly different. There was a renewed sense of purpose among the staff, many of whom had previously been just going through the motions. Now, they were invested in the success of the business, knowing that their success was tied to the success of their customers. Chris held regular meetings with the sales team, not just to discuss sales targets, but to hear feedback, share customer stories, and celebrate wins. It was no longer about pushing quotas, it was about fostering a culture of honesty and integrity. Salespeople now took the time to understand their customers' needs, offering them vehicles that were truly suited to their lifestyles, rather than pushing them toward the most expensive option. Mitchell Motors also began to make its mark in the local community. Chris understood that trust wasn't just something you built with customers, it had to be earned by being a good corporate citizen. The dealership became involved in local charity events, sponsoring youth sports teams and contributing to community programs that helped families in need. Chris also instituted a scholarship fund in honor of the customers who had been wronged in the past. This fund was dedicated to helping young people in the community afford college, a way to give back and invest in the future of the area. As Mitchell Motors became more involved in local initiatives, the dealership's reputation grew stronger. People started to see the business as one that was genuinely committed to improving the lives of its customers and the community around it. As the dealership gained momentum, Chris noticed a shift in how the business was perceived. Customers who had once been wary of Mitchell Motors were now returning, encouraged by the changes they had seen and heard about. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon people were coming from neighboring towns just to experience the new atmosphere. They came for the transparent pricing, for the commitment to honesty, and for the genuine customer service. And they stayed because they felt like they were treated with respect, not as a source of profit, but as a valued customer. Chris realized that slowly but surely, Mitchell Motors was becoming a model for ethical business in the auto industry. It was a long and difficult road, but Chris was proud of what they had accomplished. The dealership had not only turned a corner in terms of its operations, but had become a beacon of integrity in an industry that was often associated with deceit. As he looked around the showroom one quiet evening, with the sun casting long shadows across the lot, Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Mitchell Motors was more than just a business. It was a place where customers could trust that they were getting a fair deal, and that was worth more than any sale or bottom line. The hard work had paid off. Chris had restored the integrity of the dealership, earning back the trust that had been lost, and now Mitchell Motors was stronger than ever. At Deep Inside HQ, we're dedicated to bringing you the untold stories and uncovering the truth behind every corporate twist and turn. If you believe in transparency, justice, and the power of the truth, join us on this journey. Hit that subscribe button, and don't miss out on the stories that could change everything you thought you knew about the business world. Dive deeper with us, because the truth is just the beginning. Share, subscribe, and stay tuned for more riveting content, only here at Deep Inside HQ.